Well, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be able to be here today. I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. And in particular, I'd like to thank Professor Christine Malonga of the University of Manitoba and David Shimke of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO and Daryl Seib from the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission for making this symposium possible. The idea of framing today's conversation through a human rights lens is important and it is imperative. The world and the challenges we face become clearer when viewed through a human rights lens. No one is forgotten, no one is left behind, and when addressing the institutional and systemic oppression within the context of African descent identities, human rights must be central. In fact, they are paramount. So too are words. Words matter. They have the power to shame, blame, and maim. There is no place in society for hateful words. They are the impetus for hate crime. There is no place for words that incite violence or racial discrimination. In Canada, racial discrimination and oppression are real. They are prevalent. They are corrosive. Words can be weapons. They incite hatred, fuel racism, and prop up institutional and systemic attitudes that should not exist. This is a reality that people of African descent in Canada know all too well. It is experienced every day in our towns, our cities, and in the rural areas. But race, in an interpersonal and structural sense, is not real. It's a social construct, not backed by science, but it is perpetuated by the language we use, by words. Again, words matter. So does action. The death of George Floyd on May the 25th, 2020, sparked a wave of demonstrations throughout Canada and America and around the world. Millions of people took to the streets, pressuring their governments to address racism and allegations of police misconduct. They rallied, marched, and demonstrated for basic human rights. The Black Lives Matter movement was central to this effort. It shed light on the ongoing violence and systemic racism that people of African descent have faced for generations. The movement quickly spread across the 49th parallel and throughout Canada, in big cities and in small centers. Citizens rallied and called to attention that lives and the rights of people of African descent need to be supported and protected. It didn't stop there. Indigenous communities became involved. Black and Indigenous Lives Matter rallies were held across this country. They broadened the conversation. They drew attention to racism, oppression, systemic discrimination, over-incarceration, inequities in education, employment, health, housing, and income faced by both communities. It was a conversation as a nation we needed to have. And it's a conversation that we must continue to have. Why? Because a 2019 Environics poll reported that 54% of Canadians of African descent and 53% of Indigenous people said they've experienced discrimination due to race or ethnicity from time to time, if not regularly. Because a disproportionate number of Indigenous women and girls are murdered or missing. Because Indigenous children and children of African descent are overrepresented in childhood apprehension statistics. Because people of African descent are more likely than any other racial group in Canada to be victims of hate crime. Because people from both communities are vastly overrepresented in Canada's prison systems. All of this indicates a need for change and the healing of broken relationships. Broken relationships and fractured promises are not new in Canada. They have deep roots. Canada has a long history of injustices toward Indigenous people and people of African descent. So it's understandable that Indigenous people demonstrated in the streets in the months after George Floyd's death. When they stood in solidarity with people of African descent and other marginalized communities, it was an outpouring of empathy and frustration, of anguish, of pain that comes from systemic racism and the traumas that accompany it. At the same time, however, I saw courage, dignity, and hope. Hope for justice, hope for equality, hope for a better future. I too have hope for a better future, for a society that is inclusive and harmonious. As mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I'm the Chief Commissioner of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. Human rights codes and declarations are designed to do two things. Number one, to promote the recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. And secondly, to further public policy that ensures every person is free and equal in dignity and rights, and to discourage and eliminate discrimination. These objectives are fundamental to human rights. Before I was Chief Commissioner, I was a Treaty Commissioner in Saskatchewan, working on issues facing Indigenous people in my home province. Issues like education, employment, health, housing, and justice. These issues are also explicitly stated in the objectives of the International Decade for People of African Descent. These are issues that must be addressed. I also served 39 years as a provincial court judge in Saskatchewan. I only mention these past experiences to say this. I have firsthand experience in seeing that it is clear that when a single community struggles under the weight of oppression, society suffers. I've heard it from community elders, legal experts, and the community leaders. To me, the truth is inescapable. The health and well-being of our society is directly proportional to two things. Firstly, the health and well-being of our communities, and secondly, how well individuals and groups are included in all aspects of community life. To have healthy communities requires a real and demonstrable sense of belonging. When people belong, the community moves forward. To achieve this sense of belonging, you have to have inclusion. That is imperative. But in order to be included, you have to have the capacity to participate. In order to participate, you often need accommodation. Simply put, action and accommodation are needed to create inclusion. The tools that make inclusion possible are human rights legislation, legal precedent, conventions, declarations, and protocols from the United Nations. The poster for this event notes that two UN documents guide the conversation here today. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the UNESCO Declaration on Race and Racial Prejudice. Today's conversation is about using the human rights lens to examine the issues and challenges we face as a society. It helps us to understand what's at stake, to inform our ideas, to shape our country, and to deal with trauma. I know this is part of the next symposium, but the International Decade for People of African Descent was designed to address the inequality and the trauma experienced by people of African descent. I'd be remiss not to mention that. I'd also be remiss not to tell you that the UN Declaration of Human Rights recognizes that every single human being deserves equal moral consideration. Every person is a member of the human family. The Saskatchewan Human Rights Commissions and all human rights commissions where they exist in the Western world owe their existence to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Why? Because that was the world's response to the Holocaust and the traumas of the Holocaust. It created the foundation for the rights revolution. It was a revolution that witnessed human rights move to the forefront of national and international consciousness. Human rights commissions were created and human rights codes were implemented to protect the inherent dignity and the inalienable rights of all citizens. Many people understand that they have rights. However, there's little understanding of the responsibilities that come with those rights. Rights and responsibilities come together. They coexist. To sustain the advancement of human rights and to uphold our democratic freedoms, we now need a corresponding responsibility revolution in the 21st century. What I'm asking and what this symposium is asking is that everyone here today be part of this new revolution, the responsibility revolution. Why is it so critical at this time? We're in crisis. We are experiencing outright attacks on human rights and democratic ideals. Racism, hate, and populism are on the rise. Systemic discrimination is pervasive. Some citizens are disengaged. Some citizens are losing faith in democratic institutions. They accept half-truths and simple answers to complex questions. Democracy is fragile. Some citizens take our democracy, our human rights, and our freedoms for granted. That is perilous. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, but one cannot be vigilant unless one has knowledge. Education generates knowledge. Education is the way forward. It paves the path to a better future. Traditionally, education focuses on training for a job through numeracy and literacy. Those are the old 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. There'll always be the bread and butter of education, but there's a new pathway required, a new foundation required. We need to add the social component, a citizenship education component. Citizenship education recognizes that the education system has a role in building the whole citizen through the new 3 R's, rights, responsibility, and respect. Citizenship answers these questions. What does it mean to be a citizen? What are the rights of citizenship? But equally important, what are the responsibilities that accompany those rights? And how do you build and maintain respect for every citizen, no exceptions? These questions need to be answered because every human being is someone's child. Every child, every single person deserves equal moral consideration. Again, no exceptions. We need to explicitly teach 5 competencies of Canadian citizenship in the schools from grades K to 12. We need to teach students to be enlightened, to be ethical, to be engaged, empowered, and most importantly, empathetic. A moment ago, when I spoke about hopes for a better future, I mentioned 2 key things, inclusion and harmony. We've already discussed inclusion, but how do we create harmony? Harmony that is so desperately needed in Canada, in our country. Harmony is generated by respect. Respect is created by empathy. Empathy is created by understanding. Understanding is created by knowledge. Knowledge is created by education. Education is the foundation for the peace, harmony, and respect we so desperately need in Canadian society. This conference is a good example of what we need in our society. The University of Manitoba and the Canadian Commission for UNESCO are demonstrating that particular important commitment here today through this symposium. Educations and conversations like this are the vaccine for ignorance, hatred, and malice. Martin Luther King famously said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And I say to you this afternoon, oppression anywhere is a threat to harmony everywhere. As citizens, it is our responsibility to stand united in the face of intolerance and malice. We must remain vigilant. We must remember that words matter. We must act to eradicate bigotry, racism, systemic discrimination in all its forms. In the aftermath of trauma and oppression, it is encouraging to see people from diverse backgrounds, irrespective of perceived race, creed, or other distinguishing factors which often divide our society, are coming together in solidarity to have these discussions. This is evidence that there is more that unites us than divides us. We must accept that all people are created with equal and inalienable rights, and that they are equal before the law. As responsible citizens and members of the one human family, it is our responsibility to respect others, to treat each other with dignity, to protect and uphold the equality and the rights of all human beings. Thank you very much, and best wishes.